She was already gone when they came for her. That was the thing none of the Vethal archives would ever record correctly. They would write that the Ashborn Orc queen had been cornered, had been taken, had been studied, had been unmade. They would write it in their precise, crystalline script on plates of compressed starlight, and every syllable would be accurate except for the most important one. The truth was that Kaelra Ashborn chose the moment she left. She chose the door. She chose the dark. And before the last of her people's fires went out, she looked back at the Vethal harvester ship hanging over the ruins of what had once been a mountain city, and she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "If they ask, tell them I was never here." Then she stepped into the nothing, and she took the fire with her. The Vethal had been harvesting sentient species for 6,000 years before they found the Ashborn. They were not cruel in the way that smaller intelligences imagined cruelty. They did not torture. They did not gloat. They moved through the galaxy with the patient, organized efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. They arrived, they catalogued, they extracted what was useful, they departed. What was left behind was technically still alive, in the way that a body with its nervous system removed is technically still alive. The Vethal were not interested in killing. They were interested in what lived inside the bodies, in what sparked and fired in the dense tissue of organics who had survived long enough to develop something the Vethal could not grow themselves: genuine resilience. They called it by a word in their own language that translated, imprecisely, as asterisk the quality that endures, when it should not asterisk. In their logs, they abbreviated it TQE. They had found TQE in 47 species across 6,000 years. In 39 of those cases, they had extracted it successfully. In the remaining 8, the subjects had died on the table before the procedure was complete. The Ashborn Orcs were supposed to be number 48. They had been watching the Ashborn for 2 generations before they moved. The Vethal were nothing if not methodical. They had stationed a passive monitoring array in the outer debris field of the Ashborn star system, a ring of instruments so quiet and cold that no scanners the Ashborn possessed could detect them, and for 41 years they watched. They catalogued the Ashborn's biology: the dense musculature adapted for high-gravity highland terrain, the redundant cardiovascular system, the bone structure reinforced by mineral compounds the Ashborn absorbed from their mountain springs. They catalogued the Ashborn's culture, the clan structure built around the Ashborn queens, who were not rulers in the political sense, but something closer to living memory. Each queen absorbed the accumulated knowledge and trauma and stubborn persistence of her bloodline going back 17 generations. A biological archive of everything the Ashborn had survived. They catalogued the Ashborn's history of survival: 16 separate extinction-level events in 300 years, each one apparently unsurvivable, each one survived. The Vethal researcher assigned to the Ashborn file, a 12-limbed entity of crystalline neural architecture named Vedrick San, wrote in the preliminary report that the Ashborn were the most concentrated single specimen of TQE she had ever encountered. The TQE was not distributed evenly through the population. It pooled, she wrote, in the queens, in the bloodline, in the dense inherited memory tissue that each queen carried in a specialized gland behind her sternum. If you wanted TQE from the Ashborn, you needed only one thing: the last living queen. The last living queen was Kaelra. Vedrick San submitted her proposal for extraction with calm efficiency. The Vethal High Processing Collective approved it in 11 seconds. 3 ships were dispatched. Vedrick San herself went along. She never missed an extraction she had designed. She expected it to take 4 days. Kaelra was 31 years old when the ships came, which in Vethal years was barely a developmental warm-up, but in Ashborn years was old enough to have fought in 2 clan wars, buried a husband, raised 3 children to adulthood, and absorbed the memory deaths of 7 queens before her. She did not feel young. She felt like a mountain that had been struck by lightning many times and had stopped counting. She was at the southern watchtower of Carthage when the night sky cracked open. It was not a dramatic cracking. The Vethal did not announce themselves with fire or sound. One moment the stars were there, scattered and familiar above the mountain ridgeline, and the next moment a section of the sky simply ceased to be stars. It became a shape, darker than the dark around it, blotting out the constellations one by one as it descended. Kaelra watched it. She held very still, in the way her grandmother had taught her to hold still when something new and dangerous appeared. No sudden movement, no sound, full attention. Her second in command, a scarred veteran named Dressin who had been with her since the Second Clan War, appeared at her elbow. "What is it?" he said. It was not a question. "I don't know," she said. "Weapon." She thought about it. The shape was wrong for anything she understood as a weapon. Too slow, too deliberate. No heat signature she could feel on her face even now that it was close enough to block half the sky. "Something that hunts," she said. She sent runners to the 4 clan towers. Not alarm runners, information runners. She wanted the clan heads to know before they panicked, to know before the watchers on the walls started screaming. She wanted everyone to see what she had already seen, which was that the shape was not falling. It was parking. It was settling itself above Carthage with the patient, unhurried confidence of something that did not need to hurry because it had already decided how this ended. Kaelra recognized that confidence. She had worn it herself occasionally when she was very sure. It frightened her more than fire would have. The first contact came not as a signal or a broadcast, but as a package. It arrived at the main gate of Carthage at dawn, simply sat there when the gate watchers opened the outer doors, a smooth ovoid object the color of old bone, about the size of a large melon. No tracks in the dirt around it. No indication of how it had gotten there. The gate watchers called for Kaelra, and she came, and she studied the object for a long time without touching it. "It's a lamp," said Dressin, squinting at it, "or it looks like one." It did look like one. It had a particular quality of light even in the morning brightness, a faint luminescence at its core, pulsing very slowly, like something breathing. "Don't touch it," Kaelra said. "I wasn't going to. Tell everyone not to touch it." She had one of the clan engineers build a containment frame and move the object into the study hall, where the oldest and most cautious of the Ashborn scholars could examine it without putting it near anyone who couldn't be trusted to control their curiosity. She watched them work for 3 hours. Then she went back to the wall and looked up at the ship and thought about what kind of mind sent a gift to the people it was about to take. The kind, she decided, that didn't think you were people. The lamp's true function revealed itself that evening when one of the younger engineers, a 17-year-old named Save who had more courage than judgment, and had been specifically told not to, plugged the object into a resonance coil to measure its power draw. The resonance coil immediately emitted a sound that no Ashborn present had ever heard before, a single high-pitched frequency that hit the nervous system like a spike. Save went down instantly, body rigid, teeth locked, every muscle in his body trying to tear itself free of his bones. The sound lasted 6 seconds before the engineers managed to cut the coil. Save survived barely. It took him 2 days to stop shaking. The lamp, once unplugged, looked exactly as it had before, patient, luminescent, waiting. Kaelra looked at it for a long time in the darkened study hall, just the two of them. She understood what it was now. Not a weapon, not in the way Ashborn weapons worked, it was a test. It was asking, how much can you take before you break? It was measuring her people's resilience the way a doctor measures pulse rate, clinically, with mild professional interest. "You want to know what we're made of," she said to the empty room, to the ship she knew was listening even through the stone of the mountain walls. "You want to know what's inside us." She picked up the lamp and turned it over in her hands. The light inside it pulsed. She thought about her grandmother's memory, which she carried in the gland behind her sternum, the feeling of the memory, the specific texture of it, The great-grandmother before grandmother's voice during the Second Plague when the Ashborn had buried 40,000 of their own in a season and kept going. She felt the weight of that. She felt all 17 generations of that weight, compressed and alive in her chest. She set the lamp down. "You're going to be disappointed," she said. The second delivery arrived the following night, and the third the night after that. They were not lamps. The Vethal, having apparently received whatever data they needed from the lamp experiment, moved on to more direct assessments. The second delivery was a compound that, when it got into the water supply, and it did, through a ventilation duct that the Ashborn's engineers hadn't thought to seal, caused a temporary paralysis in anyone with Ashborn-specific blood markers. The compound lasted about 4 hours. By the time the paralysis cleared, the Vethal had sent collection teams into the lower city. They were fast, they were clinical, they were, Kael'ra thought, genuinely excellent at what they did. They got 11 people in that first raid. She wasn't one of them. Dressen had seen the vent breach and dragged her out of the water chain before she drank anything, and she had watched from a hidden gallery above the paralysis ward as the collection teams moved through, tall, many-limbed figures in sealed suits, carrying the paralyzed Ashborn with the same careful, impersonal efficiency with which you might carry rare objects you didn't want to damage. They spoke to each other in their own language, quick clicks and resonances, and once, one of them paused over an elderly woman named Gret who had woken early from the paralysis and was trying to drag herself away across the stone floor. The collector watched Gret for a moment. Then it produced a small instrument and made a notation. Then it picked Gret up. Kael'ra had to put her hand over her mouth to keep quiet. She spent 3 days planning in a sealed room with Dressen and 7 of the most trusted people she had. "We can't fight them directly," said one of the clan heads, a blocky woman named Farron who had the reputation of saying blunt things accurately. "We've seen their bodies. We've seen their suits. We've seen what they do to people they pick up. Direct confrontation is how we die faster." "Yes," Kael'ra said. "So what do we do?" Kael'ra had the lamp on the table. She'd been looking at it on and off for 3 days. "They're not here to kill us," she said. "They've been very careful not to kill anyone. They want us alive." "The ones they took are alive." "I don't know. But their extraction methodology is built for keeping things alive. Their paralysis agent was dosed precisely, enough to immobilize, not enough to affect the heart." She paused. "They know our biology very well. They've been studying us for a long time." "How long?" She looked at Dressen. He had worked out the monitoring array in the outer debris field by backtracking the trajectory of one of the collection team's shuttles. He told them about it. The room went quiet. 40 years, said Farron. "At least," said Dressen. Another silence. Kael'ra let it settle. "They've been watching us for 40 years, she said. "They know everything about us. They know our biology, our city layout, our water systems, our ventilation. They know our clan structure. They know that the TQE, whatever it is they're after, pools in the Queen's." She touched the gland behind her sternum. "They know they need me," she said. "Then we need to get you out," said Farron. "Yes, but not until I give them a reason to follow me instead of staying here." What followed was 12 days that would eventually become the most argued-over period in the Ashborn historical record. Argued over because the survivors all remembered it differently. And what each of them remembered was so strange that every account seemed individually implausible and collectively impossible. Kael'ra's plan was built on a thing she had learned from the oldest memory she carried, from the 16th generation grandmother, who had survived the Kethan occupation 800 years ago. The memory was not of battle. It was of a specific afternoon during the occupation when the soldiers had come to the village where that grandmother lived, looking for the resistance leader who had been organizing raids on supply lines. They had gone door to door. The grandmother had been hiding the resistance leader in her root cellar, and she had stood in her doorway and looked at the soldiers and done a thing so counterintuitive that it had worked. She had not pretended the leader wasn't there. She had told the soldiers where he was. Or rather, she had told the soldiers where he was going to be. She had given them perfect, accurate information about a location and a time. Everything she said was true, and the resistance leader had been nowhere near any of it. You couldn't deceive them, Kaelra explained to her people. They had 40 years of intelligence on Carthage. They knew everything. Any false information would be detected immediately. But there was a difference between true information and complete information. And there was something else, something the lamp had confirmed for her. The Vethal were excellent scientists. They studied. They measured. They took careful notes. They were, in every observable sense, exactly as brilliant as they thought they were. And brilliant people, in Kaelra's experience, had one specific vulnerability. They trusted their own conclusions. She started leaving them things to find. Not plants, not traps, things that were genuinely hers. A practice log from her morning weapons work. A personal journal, written in full in her own hand, in a language they had almost certainly already decoded. The journal contained exactly the thoughts a cornered queen would have. Fear, anger, despair, the specific grief of watching her city be taken apart piece by piece. She felt slightly sick writing it because most of it was true, and the parts that weren't true were surrounded by so much truth that they were invisible. She wrote in the journal about the hidden passage in the eastern mountain face. She described it in enough detail to confirm that it existed. She described it as her escape route. She wrote that she planned to use it. The passage existed. It led to a small chamber 200 meters into the mountain. It had enough supplies stocked in it for a week's survival and nothing else. It was, in the plainest possible sense, exactly what she described in the journal. It was also not where she was going. The Vethal found the journal on the 8th day. She knew they'd found it because their patrol pattern shifted. The collection teams that had been sweeping the outer districts began concentrating near the eastern face. She watched the shift from the inner gallery and felt something cold and functional settle over her. They moved the way she'd expected them to. They were thorough. They were logical. They were exactly as predictable as something that had been successfully doing this for 6,000 years. She went a fine dressing. 2 days, she said. Maybe less. Your people are ready. She had spent the 12 days doing something the Vethal had not detected because they hadn't known to look for it. She had been redistributing the Ashborn. Not evacuating, the Vethal monitored all outgoing routes and would intercept any mass movement. She had been seeding her people into the mountain itself, into the ancient mine tunnels and aquifer channels that didn't appear on any map the Vethal could have acquired, because they predated the current city by 400 years, and had been filled in and reopened so many times over the centuries that they weren't in any surveyor's record. Small groups, moving 1 or 2 at a time over 12 days, carrying only what they could walk with. 240 people. The rest of the Ashborn, almost 1,000, were spread across the Vethal's containment protocols, which she could not break, which she accepted she could not break. She had done the arithmetic and hated the arithmetic and done it again and kept coming back to the same place. She could save 240. She could not save 1,000 without losing all of them. She accepted this the way the mountain accepted lightning, because it had no choice. They're ready, she said. On the 11th night, she performed the oldest ritual of the Ashborn queens. There was no audience. Dressin kept watch outside the sealed room while she worked alone for 3 hours with the instruments the ritual required. A small fire, a shallow bowl, a specific sequence of words that were not prayers but something older than prayers, statements of intent spoken aloud, so that the speaker could hear herself make them. The ritual was for passing on the memory line. When a queen knew she was dying, she would spend 3 hours encoding her generation's memories, everything she had absorbed, everything she had experienced, everything she had learned, into the physical structure of a receiver. Either her successor, if one was available, or, if no successor was available, a physical object that could carry the encoding until a successor was found. There was no successor. Kael'ra encoded 17 generations into a stone. Not a special stone, a piece of plain mountain granite she had picked up from the floor of the passage on the eastern face. She chose it for exactly that reason. It was completely, utterly ordinary. It looked like any other piece of rock that had fallen from a ceiling somewhere. She spent 3 hours filling it with everything the Ashborn had ever been. Every plague survived. Every occupation endured. Every war that should have ended them and hadn't. Every stubborn, unreasonable, unglamorous decision to keep going when stopping would have been easier. When she was done, she put the stone in a pocket. She thought, if they take me and find nothing in the gland, they'll look for another source. They'll study everything I carried. They'll study the stone eventually, and when they open it. She didn't finish the thought, she let it sit. They came for the eastern passage on the morning of the 12th day, exactly as she had predicted, exactly as she had arranged for them to find her there. She was standing at the passage entrance when the collection team arrived, 5 of them, in their suits, moving with the smooth, coordinated precision of a species that had done this 48 times across 6,000 years. She held still. She let them scan her. She let them confirm she was who they were looking for. One of them, she assumed it was Vedric's son, though she had no way to confirm this, produced a translation instrument and spoke to her in approximated Ashborn. "You are the last queen," it said. "Yes," she said. "You carry the archive." "Yes." "You have been isolated, your people are contained, there is no assistance coming." A pause. "You understand this?" "Yes," she said. Vedric's son, if it was Vedric's son, seemed to study her for a moment. The suit's sensors were probably running multiple assessments, biometric, biochemical, neural, looking for the signs of a bluff, a trap, a hidden variable. "Your cooperation will not prevent the procedure," it said, "but it will prevent unnecessary damage to your physical matrix. The procedure is most efficient when the subject is calm." "I understand," Kael'ra said. She looked up at the ship above them, the great dark shape against the morning sky. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked back at Vedric's son. "Can I ask you something?" A pause. "Yes." "What do you do with what you take, with the takeaway?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, "We study it, we attempt to replicate it, we have not yet succeeded." "You've been trying for 6,000 years, and you haven't succeeded. The process is complex." She almost said something then, something about how you couldn't study your way into understanding something you didn't have the capacity to feel. Something about how resilience wasn't a compound in a gland, wasn't a tissue sample, wasn't extractable by anyone who didn't know what it cost. But she didn't say any of it. She had learned something in 12 days of leaving true things in places to be found. The most useful truths were the ones you didn't speak out loud. "I'm ready," she said. The procedure took 11 hours. She was conscious for most of it, in a distant, medicated way. The Vethel kept their subjects aware because it produced better readings. She lay in a chamber that was very clean and very cold and smelled like nothing at all, which was the most alien thing about it to her, because everything in her life had always smelled like something: stone and pine smoke, and the particular mineral sharpness of mountain water. The absence of smell was the most disorienting part. Vedric's son worked over her with patient, careful precision. The instruments were extraordinary. She could feel them, but not quite as pain, more as information, as if the procedure was reading her the way a scholar reads a text, attentively, linearly, looking for specific passages. She felt the gland behind her sternum being accessed, felt the memory encoding being read off layer by layer, felt 17 generations of Ashborn survival being cataloged. She thought, read everything you want. Take everything that's in there, take all of it. She thought, I already made a copy. She felt the gland empty. She felt the specific absence of 17 generations, like a weight lifted, and it was not a relief. It was a grief, a specific and terrible grief, because those memories had been hers, had been her people's, had been the accumulated weight of everything the Ashborn had endured and survived and transmitted forward. She felt them leave. She did not stop them leaving. She lay still and let it happen. But the stone was still in her pocket. They had not taken her clothes. She understood afterward that this was because the Vethal procedure was not rough. It was surgical, and surgeries don't require you to disrobe when the access point is specific and known. Vedric's son had known exactly what she was looking for and had gone exactly there. The stone in the left pocket of Kaelra's outer garment was a piece of mountain rock the size of a closed fist. Every scan the Vethal had run on her had catalogued it as inorganic mineral substrate, mountain granite, density consistent with local geological samples. They were not wrong. It was inorganic, it was mineral, it was granite. It was also carrying 17 generations of encoded Ashborn memory, in a format that Vethal instruments could not detect, because it was not in any biological medium. Their instruments were calibrated to read. It was encoded in the crystal lattice of the stone itself, in the microscopic fault lines and inclusions that Kaelra had spent 3 hours inscribing with the oldest instrument the Ashborn possessed. Her own hands, her own intent, her own knowledge of the encoding technique that had been passed from queen to queen for 800 years and had never been written down anywhere because it didn't work unless you knew it in your body. Vedric's son wrote in her extraction report that the subject had yielded excellent TQE. She noted minor irregularities in the final readings, a slight apparent reduction in encoding density compared to projected maximum, but attributed this to natural variation in the biological substrate. Her overall assessment was positive. The extraction had been successful. She marked the Ashborn file closed. Kaelra was released on the 3rd day after the procedure. This was standard Vethal practice. After extraction, subjects were returned to their point of origin to observe the post-procedure behavioral response in their native environment. It provided useful longitudinal data. The subject was monitored remotely for 60 days, then the monitoring was discontinued. She was set down in the ruins of the outer district of Carthage in the early morning. The collection teams had already left. The ship was still there overhead, patient and dark, watching. She stood in the rubble of the city she had been born in, and she held still and she breathed. She felt the absence of the memories like a hollow space behind her sternum. She felt the stone in her pocket. She put her hand over it. She thought about the 240 people in the tunnels under the mountain. She thought about the supplies they had, the routes she had mapped for them, the 3 exit points she had scouted in the months before the ships came, when she had still been hoping it wouldn't come to this but had been preparing in case it did, because that was what queens did. That was what the 17 generations of inherited memory had always been about. Prepare, adapt, survive, transmit. The hollow space behind her sternum ached. She let it ache. The ache was honest. She went to find the tunnel entrance. Dressen was there. He had the look of a man who had been still for a very long time waiting, and was now controlling the desire to move. "They let you go," he said. "They took what they came for," she said. "They took everything." She looked at him. He understood Ashborn queens. He had served under her mother and her grandmother. He knew what was in the gland. "They took everything that was in the gland," she said carefully. She watched him understand. She watched the understanding reach his face and get controlled before it became readable. "And the stone," he said quietly. She took it out of her pocket and held it in her open palm. An ordinary piece of mountain granite, a chip of rock that could have fallen from any ceiling. "Everything," she said. "All 17 generations." Dressen looked at the stone for a long time. Then he looked at her. "What do we do now?" She put the stone back in her pocket. "We go deeper," she said. We find a successor, we teach her the encoding technique, we pass this on." She paused. "And we find the other Ashborn, the ones they took. We find them and we get them back, or we spend the rest of our lives trying." "That's a long list." "Yes. The ship is still there." "I know." She looked up at the sky through the broken roof of the tunnel entrance, a ragged rectangle of morning blue with the dark bulk of the Vethal ship blocking the upper quadrant of it. Still parked, still patient, still watching with its 40 years of instruments, and its 6,000 years of successful extractions, and its absolute confidence that the Ashborn were now catalogued and filed and closed. She looked at the ship for a long moment. She felt 17 empty generations behind her sternum. She felt one full stone in her pocket. She did the arithmetic again, the one she had done every day for 12 days, the one that always came out the same terrible way, and she made her peace with the arithmetic again, and she stopped looking at the ship. "Let's go," she said. Vedrik San's extraction report on the Ashborn was cited 12 times in Vethal academic literature over the next 400 years. The Ashborn TQE samples, once processed, proved to be among the most dense and complex the collective had ever catalogued. Replication attempts failed, as replication attempts had always failed, but the samples themselves were considered a significant contribution to the ongoing study of sentient resilience. The monitoring discontinued on schedule, 60 days after Kaelra's release, as per standard protocol. The file was marked closed. 40 years later, an anomaly appeared in the Vethal Early Warning Network, a signal from the outer debris field of the Ashborn system, specifically from the location where the passive monitoring array had been stationed. The array had, at some point between its last confirmed transmission and this one, been modified, repurposed. The signal it was now broadcasting was not a Vethal monitoring protocol. It was an Ashborn communication format. Specifically, one of the secondary dialects used in the pre-colonial mountain clans, which the Vethal linguistic database identified as having been in use approximately 400 years before the civilization they had catalogued. The collective ran an analysis. The signal appeared to be directed outward, toward other systems. It appeared to be a beacon of the kind used by species that want to be found by something specific. The collective noted the anomaly. It was considered minor. It was assigned a low-priority investigation flag. The flag sat in the queue for 17 years. By then, of course, the Ashborn had already been found. What the Vethal had not understood about the archive in the stone, what they could not have understood, because understanding it would have required being the thing they were trying to study, was that encoded memory is not data. It is not a text to be read. It is not a sample to be extracted and analyzed in a laboratory that smells like nothing. Encoded memory, in the Ashborn tradition, is instruction. When a young woman named Save, the same Save who had survived the lamp experiment, now grown, now carrying the scar of it in the way she held her left shoulder, received the encoding from the stone, she did not receive information. She received weight. She received the specific, accumulated, transmitted weight of every decision the Ashborn had made over 417 years to keep going when stopping would have been easier. She received the memory of every plague and occupation and war and extraction. She received 17 generations of the practiced art of surviving something that was absolutely certain you wouldn't. She received the memory of Kaelra encoding the stone. She received the 3 hours of that night, the fire, the bowl, the words spoken aloud so the speaker could hear herself make them. She received the specific quality of what Kaelra had felt in those 3 hours. The grief of the empty gland, the weight of 1,000 people she could not save, the cold arithmetic of 240, and underneath all of it, running through it like a vein of iron through granite, the particular human-adjacent stubborn unreasonableness of a queen who would not let the weight go down without being carried somewhere first. Save carried it, She passed it on. The person after her passed it on. The stone traveled. The encoding multiplied. The Ashborn, over the next 200 years, rebuilt themselves in the tunnels and the deep places of 7 worlds, not with the spectacular resilience of legend, but with the plain, persistent, unglamorous resilience of people who had inherited 400 years of instruction on exactly this one subject: how to survive a thing that is certain you won't. They built a network. They found the others who had been taken, most of them still alive, in the clinical, impersonal preservation of Vethal long-term storage, waiting to be studied. They took them back. Not all of them, but enough. They modified the monitoring array. They sent the beacon. They waited. The thing the Vethal had always failed to extract. The thing that had eluded 6,000 years of study, 48 extraction procedures, and the full weight of a crystalline intelligence that had never once doubted its own conclusions, was not in the gland. It was never in the gland. The gland was a library. The TQE was the librarian. And what made a librarian wasn't tissue or encoding or any chemistry that could be read off a surface by even the most sensitive instruments in the known galaxy. What made a librarian was the decision, made quietly in a dark room, to make sure the books didn't burn. Kael'ra made that decision. She had made it before Vedric's son ever found her. She made it in the moment she picked up the lamp and turned it over in her hands and said to the empty room, "You're going to be disappointed." She made it in every careful, ordinary choice that followed, the journal with true words arranged to be incomplete, the stone that looked like any other stone, the 3 hours alone with the fire and the bowl and the words spoken aloud. She made it in the final moment, stepping out of the passage mouth and into the rubble of Carthage, looking up at the ship. She had been already gone when they came for her. The Ashborn would remember that for a long time, not as the story of a queen's sacrifice, not as a legend of great power, but as something smaller and more useful. The story of a woman who understood what she was carrying, who knew that the most important thing was not to survive, but to make sure the right things outlasted her, and who chose, in the last moment before stepping into the nothing, to look back once. Just once. To make sure the fire had caught. The beacon found them. 3,000 light-years away, in a cluster of moons that did not appear in any Vethal catalog. The response came from a people who had also been extracted, also been filed, also been considered closed. They recognized the signal format, not the modern format, not the one the Vethal had cataloged, but an older one from a period of Ashborn history that had apparently ended 400 years ago. An old format, kept intact, transmitted, against all probability, across 4 centuries and 3,000 light-years by a network of people who had no particular reason to believe anyone was listening but transmitted anyway, because transmission was what the encoding instructed. The response said, "We are here." The Ashborn said, "We know." The response said, "How did you survive?" The Ashborn thought about how to answer that question. They thought about the lamp, and the empty gland, and the stone, and the 3 hours of words spoken aloud so the speaker could hear herself make them. They thought about the arithmetic that never came out the way you wanted it to. They thought about the ship overhead on the morning of the 12th day, patient and certain and already wrong. They thought about a queen who had looked back just once to check the fire. The Ashborn sent back their answer in the oldest encoding they had, the one that wasn't data, the one that was instruction, the one that took root and grew in the body of the receiver rather than sitting in a database waiting to be analyzed. The same way we always have. We made sure the right things outlasted us. And then we kept going. Save was 16, the first time she asked Kael'ra about the lamp. They had been in the tunnels for 3 months by then, and the lower passages had settled into something almost like ordinary life. Ordinary in the specific, provisional sense of people who knew their circumstances were extraordinary and had decided to behave normally inside them anyway, because the alternative was to let the circumstances win before anything worse had happened. There were children in the tunnels. There were people who argued about water allocation. There was a woman named Porath who had been a baker in Carthage and had reconstituted something close to a bakery in a side passage using a heating element salvaged from a condenser unit, which meant that some mornings the tunnels smelled like bread, which was a fact of such fundamental emotional importance that Kaelra had quietly put it in the rationing budget as a line item. She was sitting with the lamp when Save found her. She had kept the lamp. There was no particular strategic reason for keeping it. It was a Vethal weapon, and a primitive one, and it had already shown her everything it had to show. But she kept it because the alternative was to let them have it, even in the negligible sense of not caring what happened to it, and she had decided she was not going to let them have anything she could keep, even broken things, even things that had hurt her people. "Does it still work?" Save asked. Save had been 17 when she touched the resonance coil and everything went wrong, and she was 18 now, and she had the look of someone who had been frightened very suddenly by something, and had thought about that fright carefully afterward and had come to terms with it. Her left shoulder still sat slightly forward, a habit her body had developed to protect the residual nerve tenderness. She would probably always hold her shoulder like that. "Probably," Kaelra said. "Can I look at it?" Kaelra held it out. Save took it in both hands and turned it the same way Kaelra had turned it, in the same careful, deliberate way, with the same quality of attention. She was quiet for a while. Then, "It's still reading us," she said, "even now, even turned off." "I know." "How do you know?" "I put my hand over it every morning and I can feel it counting my heartbeats." She paused. "Whatever it is it's designed to do, the first function is surveillance. It sits there and it counts and it records, all the time." Save was quiet again. "Then, so they know we're down here." "They know some of us are down here. They know our biometrics. They don't know the layout of the tunnels. Those aren't in any record their survey would have captured." "And they don't know," she stopped. "The stone," Save said. "They don't know the stone." Save looked at the lamp for another long moment. Then she handed it back with a directness that suggested she had decided something. "Teach me," she said. "The encoding, the stone technique." Kaelra looked at her. Save met the look steadily. "You're not old enough," Kaelra said. "No. The encoding it takes something that you can only develop through a specific kind of experience. It requires that you felt the weight of the memories before you can carry new ones. The queens were always at least 30 before the transfer was attempted." "I know," Save said. "You'll teach me the method, the mechanics." "I won't do the encoding until I'm old enough, but I'll know how it works, and if something happens to you before." "Nothing's going to happen to me." Save's expression didn't change. It was the expression of someone who had learned not to say the obvious thing because it was too obvious to need saying. Kaelra was quiet for a moment. "Sit down," she said. The teaching took 3 weeks. Kaelra was a good teacher in the specific way that people are good at teaching things they learned under duress. She knew exactly which parts would feel impossible and which parts only felt impossible, and she knew the difference because she had felt both. She taught Save the theory of encoding, how memory, in the Ashborn tradition, was not stored in the brain the way most people assumed memory worked, but was distributed across the entire body, with the highest concentrations in the gland but threads of it running through every significant physical experience. The body remembered things the mind didn't know it was keeping. Encoding was a process of gathering those threads consciously and giving them form. "You've done it already," she told Save. "Not formally, but the lamp, your nervous system remembers that sound in a way that no abstract description of it would capture. If I told someone else what happened to you and they tried to understand it, they'd understand the words. You understand the sound. That's what encoding does for received memories. It moves them from the category of information you know into the category of experience you've had. But you can't receive what you haven't experienced, Save said. So how does the Queen receive 17 generations of things that happened before she was born? The body is not as literal as you think. Kaelra turned the stone over in her hands. The encoding gives you the texture of the experience, not the event itself. You receive the shape of what it felt like to survive the Kethan occupation, not the specific memories, the specific quality of what the survivors carried forward afterward, the way they held themselves, the things they stopped being afraid of because they had been afraid of something worse, the decisions that felt ordinary to them because they had made harder ones. Save thought about this for a long time. That's what TQE is, she said finally. That's what they were trying to extract. Yes. And they thought it was in the gland, because that's where the encoding is stored. Yes. But the encoding is just the library. The TQE is, she stopped, working it out. The TQE is what the person does with the library. Kaelra looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that family. You're going to be a good queen, she said. Save looked distinctly uncomfortable with this, which was exactly the right response. The queens who had been bad at it were usually the ones who had been comfortable with the idea. The Vethal ship left on the 43rd day. Dressen came down the main passage in the late afternoon and said to Kaelra, with the particular economy of expression he used for significant information, "It's gone." "You're certain?" "I've been up and back twice. Nothing in the sky. I checked the debris field angle, no interference signatures where the monitoring array was." She thought about it. Taking the array meant they were definitively closing the file. She held that possibility and examined it carefully. "They took it," she said. "They don't come back to species they've extracted. The file is closed." "Should we go back up?" "Not yet, not here." She was already thinking about the East Valley. "I want to survey the East Valley." "We start there." The East Valley was survivable. That was the whole assessment. Cold, thin-soiled, far from the springs they had used at Carthage, with a cave system at the northern face that could shelter perhaps 40 people in significant discomfort. But it was invisible, and it was far enough from Carthage that no survey would immediately associate it with the extraction site. Kaelra walked its length 3 times, measuring with her feet, thinking about what 400 years of building looked like from its very beginning. She tried to feel what the encoded generations had felt in their own beginnings. She got something, a grim, practical, unsentimental acceptance that was not quite hope and not quite its absence. A commitment to the work itself, separate from any certainty about the outcome. On the 3rd pass, she stopped at the center of the valley floor and turned in a slow circle, looking at the ridgelines, the cave mouth, the stream glittering in the low autumn light. The 15 people she had brought stood in loose groups, watching her, waiting. She thought about the encoding in the stone. 17 generations of people who had started in worse places and had built forward anyway. She tried to find the specific texture of that in her own body, the place where all that inherited knowledge lived, and found it faint now, like the echo of a sound in a room the sound has left. The hollow was still there, but the stone was there too. She turned to face her people. "We start here," she said. She died at 63, of a fever rather than anything dramatic, which was old for an Ashborn, and she spent the last week of her life doing what she had been doing for 30 years, encoding. She had passed the stone to Save 30 years earlier, when Save was 48 and had been carrying the weight of the growing settlement for a decade. Save had received the encoding in the same 3-hour ritual, and had emerged looking the way Kaelra had looked when she first understood the lamp, like someone who had just finished a very long conversation and was still holding everything that had been said. In the last week, Kaelra added a new layer to the stone. Not the formal Queen's encoding, she had already transferred that. This was something smaller and more personal, not strictly required by the tradition but necessary. She encoded the specific texture of those 12 days, the lamp in her hands, the journal written in full, with true words arranged to be incomplete, the 3 hours with the fire and the bowl in the sealed room, the stone itself, turned over in her hands, feeling like nothing at all. She encoded the specific quality of looking up at the ship on the morning of the 12th day, and not saying the thing she had thought of saying, and knowing that the most useful truths were the ones you kept. And she encoded the last moment, stepping out into the rubble, dress in waiting, the stone in her pocket, the hollow behind her sternum. The moment of doing the arithmetic one more time and getting the same answer and accepting the answer. And then, this part she encoded most carefully, the moment of looking back. Just once, to make sure the fire had caught. She put it all in the stone, for whoever came next and the next after that. Not as instruction in the abstract, but as lived specific texture. This is what it felt like. This is how it sits in the body. This is the quality of the decision when you make it with everything you have and no certainty about where it leads. She closed the encoding, she rested, then she called Save in. "You're going to want to add to this," she said. "What you've built here, add it." "I know," Save said. "And tell the one after you to add theirs." "I know." Kaora looked at her for a moment, at the shoulder that would always sit slightly forward, at the hands that had held the lamp once and would know forever what it had been measuring. "You are always going to be good at this," she said. Save looked away. Still, after 30 years, her response to being told something true about herself. "Don't start being sentimental now," she said. "It's not your style." Kaora laughed. It was a real laugh, short and genuine, and it surprised her, which was the best kind. "No," she said, "I suppose not." The stone passed through 11 more hands over the next 3 centuries. Each queen added her generation. The years of building in the East Valley, the first settlement above ground, the second extraction attempt, smaller, poorly planned, successfully evaded, the expansion to the second world, the establishment of the network, the long work of finding the others. Each encoding different in texture, each generation with its own specific quality of the thing that endured, but all of them recognizably the same tradition. Practical, clear-eyed, unglamorous, deeply stubborn. The 11th queen after Kaora was the one who sent the beacon. Her name was Rathvin, and she was 44, and she had been carrying 11 generations of context for the decision when she made it. She knew what Kaora had encoded about looking back just once. She understood in the specific bodily way of received memory that Kaora had looked back not to mourn but to confirm. Yes, the fire has caught, yes, I can go now, yes, this continues. Rathvin looked at the modified monitoring array and thought about confirmation. She sent the beacon. She waited. And when the response came back, "We are here," she felt it land the way the encoding always landed. Not as information but as weight, not as news but as the specific feeling of something held in tension for a very long time being finally, carefully, set down. She held the stone in both hands. She thought 17 generations, 28 generations now. The lamp, the empty gland, the East Valley in the cold, the arithmetic that never comes out the way you want it to. The fire that caught anyway. She thought if they ask, tell them she was never here. And then she thought, because she carried the encoding and knew what Kaora had actually meant by those words, knew the full specific weight of the moment they came from, she thought. She was always here. Every decision is still here. Every encoded moment is still here in this stone in my hands, which is a piece of ordinary mountain granite from a mountain that no longer exists, and which contains everything the Ashborn have ever decided to carry forward. She set the stone down carefully on the table in front of her. She went to write the response. The response from the distant cluster came in 3 transmissions, 3 days apart, which the Ashborn communication analysts determined was a deliberate pacing. Whoever was sending did not want to overwhelm the channel with information, wanted each piece to arrive and settle before the next arrived. It was a quality of care that the Ashborn recognized immediately, the way you recognize the manner of a person who has been in the same kind of difficult situation you have been in, even if the specific situation was different. The first transmission was short, a location, a confirmation, a single identifier that told Rathven the species had a name for themselves and had been keeping that name through whatever had been done to them. The second was longer, a list. Not a complete list. Rathven had been told it would not be complete, that there were gaps, that some of what had been lost was genuinely lost, and she should know that before she asked more questions. But it was longer than she had expected, far longer. Species who had been extracted, filed, and left behind, who had done the same arithmetic the Ashborn had done, and come up with different numbers in different circumstances, but had all arrived at the same conclusion, that the most important variable was transmission, that you could lose almost everything else as long as you didn't lose the ability to pass something forward. The third transmission was a question. It said, how did you keep the encoding intact? We have lost ours 3 times. We rebuild from fragments. We want to understand the stone. Rathven read this 3 times. She thought about Kaelra encoding 3 hours of a single night. She thought about Save, young, holding the lamp carefully, understanding exactly what it measured. She thought about the 11 queens between Kaelra and herself, each adding their generation, the stone growing heavier not because it was accumulating mass, but because it was accumulating decision. The accumulated, compressed, transmitted texture of every generation that had decided the weight was worth carrying. She thought about how to explain this in a way that wasn't just words. Then she remembered what Kaelra had encoded. The most useful truths were the ones you didn't speak out loud. The ones you transmitted in a form that had to be received in the body, rather than parsed in the mind. She thought about the stone. She thought about a piece of ordinary granite that looked like any other piece of rock that had fallen from a ceiling somewhere. She wrote back, we will send someone to show you. The technique cannot be explained. It has to be passed. That is the point of it. A pause in the transmission. Then we understand. A longer pause. Then from the distant cluster, something that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, an acknowledgement that was also an arrival. We have been waiting for someone to say that for a very long time. Rathven kept the stone on the desk where she worked, in plain sight, the way Kaelra had kept the lamp. Not because it required attention. The stone was fine. The encoding was intact. The stone had been fine for 3 centuries and would be fine for 3 more. She kept it in plain sight because she had discovered, over years of working at that desk, and reaching the moments in planning and policy and the endless practical management of a recovering civilization when the arithmetic came out wrong again, that it helped to be able to look at it. Just a piece of mountain granite, completely ordinary, from a mountain that no longer existed on a world that had been stripped and passed over by an intelligence that had been certain it had taken everything worth taking. She would look at it and she would think about what was inside it. Not the specifics. She had carried those long enough to have them in her body, to not need to consciously recall them. Just the fact of them. The specific fact that everything the Vethal had been certain they had extracted was still there, had always been there, would always be there as long as someone decided to keep passing it forward. The lamp sat on a shelf behind her. She had retrieved it from the collection that had been passed down alongside the stone. Every queen had kept it. None of them had known quite why, except that it seemed right to keep it, to not let it go, to have it visible. She understood now what it meant to keep it. It meant, we remember what you measured. We know what you were looking for. We know you never found it. We know why. She worked late most nights. There was always more to do than there were hours to do it, which was the permanent condition of people trying to rebuild something that had been taken. She did not find this demoralizing. She had the encoding of 28 generations of people who had worked in exactly these conditions and kept working, and she had the specific texture of Kaelra's own relationship to the arithmetic. You do it again, you get the same answer, you accept the answer, and then you take the next step. On the nights when the next step was hardest to see, she would pick up the stone, just for a moment, hold it, feel the weight that was not mass but something older and more specific. Then she would set it down and go back to work. The Ashborn were not finished. They were, by any reasonable accounting, barely started. There were still thousands of their people in Vethal storage, still the long work of the network, still the species across 3,000 light-years learning to pass their own encodings forward. There were new extractions happening to other species, new files being opened, new civilizations being assessed with patient certainty by an intelligence that had done this 6,000 years and had still never understood what it was looking for. All of that was true. All of that was the arithmetic Rathvin did every morning and every evening and many points in between. And in the morning, early, before the work started, she would stand at the window of the building that overlooked what was now a real settlement on a world the Vethal had never catalogued, and she would look at the sky, clear, no ships, just the pale early light of a star that had no name in any Vethal database, and she would think of a queen standing in rubble, looking back just once, to make sure the fire had caught. It had. It had caught, and it was burning, and it would keep burning because that was what the Ashborn had been, for as long as the Ashborn had been anything, the people who made sure the fire outlasted them. She turned from the window. She went to work.